The Extremis Publishing podcast is endorsed by Heart 200, Scotland's most exciting road trip. Find out more at heart200.scot.
Hello and welcome to the Extremis Publishing podcast. I'm Tom Christie. Welcome to our Burns Night special of the Extremis Publishing podcast, where I'm delighted to be joined by Mr. Robert Murray, who's the author of The Spirit of Robbie Burns and also someone who spent many years studying the work of Scotland's national bard. Robbie, welcome.
Hello Tom, it's a pleasure to be back here having a chat with you.
Well, it's always a pleasure to discuss Burns with you, Robbie, because I know he's someone who you've studied for many years. And every year in Scotland and all across the world, we celebrate the life of Robert Burns on the 25th of January. Now, what is it you think it is about that date that is so significant to Burns' life?
The 25th of January, 1759, a momentous occasion when Robert Burns entered the world in that clay biggin in Alloway. What a man, and it's often been said that he was heaven sent, but in actual fact, perhaps he was, but the brain was developed. His education seen to by his father, who himself was a writer, a man who worked on the land, and yet he wrote a guiding book for the family on religious matters. The father was extremely important, and of course Burns's mother and a relative, Betty Davidson, who worked with them in the cottage. Burns soaked up all of this was from the very earliest infant years. So it's no surprise, it's hard work. Burns himself studied hard at an early age and was an avid reader and every aspect of life. So yes, perhaps he wasn't gifted to the world with all of that. He worked jolly hard to get where he was.
Now, it's fair to say that Robert Burns' literary works took the country by storm when they were first published. But of course Burns was much more than just a poet. He soon became a major cultural figure, not just in Scotland, but much further afield. What kind of impact do you think he had on the country in his lifetime?
Quite huge, I think. Without being too naive about it, Burns opened up for the population at large a huge insight into their lives. I think he was able to plot their position in life. There was no one who was a spokesperson for the hard-working, poverty-stricken people in Scotland. The gentry, the landed gentry, had the money and the votes in government, political world. The population at large had no say. They were victims of circumstance and poverty. And Burns, in his writing, allowed people who were able to read, and I have to say, in passing, one of the things that's been quite important is that the early days of education in every small village across Scotland, where reading and writing was part of an elementary school education, without that, a great deal of the understanding of Burns would never have been initially understood. And if someone couldn't read or write, then possibly somebody that they knew could read or write. So when Burns' first works came out, his Kilmarnock edition, the fact that people were able to read and write was a major plus point. But more than that, when they read what Burns had to say, they identified with Burns. Burns was equally poverty-stricken by them. He certainly was a farmer, but in those days, there was little money. There was poverty all around, and inequality, and people were unafraid to argue. I think Burns gave them a voice to some extent as well, but he gave them an understanding of what the world was like, and his humour, his wit, his analysis of life, his observations, be it whatever aspect, political, nature, geographical, whatever. Burns gave people this understanding. So I think culturally he was a moving force in helping people understand that. Difficult to say how it all went on in later years, but the impact was quite amazing. And in fact, apart from the local country people who were poverty-stricken, when he went to Edinburgh shortly after the publication in Kilmarnock, he was treated as a genius. He was introduced to the highest in the land, be it religious, political, legal figures. They couldn't believe that a man labelled as a ploughman could have written what he had written. And so not only did he capture the imagination and the understanding from his fellow poverty-stricken people with whom he had great admiration for the way they lived, he was understood. And I think the well-off, learned people couldn't believe that a ploughman could have written this, but it also made them look at themselves, because he had already been satirical enough in what he'd said, be it religious or politics. It made people look at themselves. So again, how far that was translated into future policies or whatever. But in those days, the small nucleus of the learned people in a tiny part of the country, i.e. the old Edinburgh, city of Edinburgh, that was an amazing achievement. Unintended, but that's what happened.
Now, one of the main ways that we celebrate the life of Robert Burns now is through the annual Burns Supper traditions. Could you describe to us some of the main elements of a Burns Supper? I mean, how do the different stages of that meal relate to Burns in his life?
Yes, it's quite interesting. First I should say, I don't think in Burns's lifetime suppers were being held. I can't put a date on it, but I would say probably the early 1800s. After Burns had passed, there were various moves to build monuments, to build statues, to build memorials, physical elements which reflected the pride that people had in what Burns had to do. And then, at that point, suppers, I think, would be held by groups of people all over the country, but mainly starting off in his own native Ayrshire. These suppers would begin to celebrate the life of Burns. And I think one of the very early things that happened was on the 13th, I think it was, the 13th of January, immediately following his publication in 1786 in the Kilmarnock edition. He was invited by the Grand Master Mason of Scotland to a dinner in Edinburgh, and that's the first recorded item I've read where Burns was toasted, and the toast then was to Brother Burns, Caledonia's Bard, and that's and the toast given that night. I've used it myself now on Immortal Memories. I refer to it as the very first toast to Robert Burns. But it wouldn't be until the 1800s when suppers became more commonplace and growing to every borough and town, city in the land would have its supper. So the supper, one of the interesting early parts of it is the piping in of the haggis. Why a haggis? Well, life in Scotland was pretty rough for the poverty-stricken peasants in the countryside. Oatmeal, and I know the English actually thought all of Scotland did eat nothing else but oatmeal, and they weren't far wrong, but variations of oatmeal would come along with different dressing, be it onions and be it various parts of pigs and animals for flavouring, all of this. So the haggis became the chieftain of the puddings. And so, in a strange way, this is still celebrated because that was a major part of life in families like Robert Burns. So yes, we have the welcome and the piping in of the haggis, and the Selkirk Grace. Of course, the Selkirk Grace has been attributed to Robert Burns, but in actual fact, it's not entirely true. But there were writings about a grace previously. I think somebody by the name of Cunningham, Alan Cunningham, attributed the Selkirk Grace to Robert Burns, but I think Mr. Cunningham attributed several things to different authors. He wasn't exactly accurate on these things. So the Selkirk Grace is given. And then the meal, of course, I've mentioned the haggis, anything Scottish, of course, Scottish soup, Scottish meat, Scottish fruits, anything Scottish is obviously got to be the mainstay of the menu. And of course, the royal toast is given in today's suppers. Now here's another interesting point, because by the early 1800s, it would have been possible, yes, that the royal toast would be given to the monarch of that day. But in Burns's time, of course, that would be the very last thing. With the Hanoverian George, that would be the very last thing Robert Burns would want to have heard. He may have been turning a little bit in his grave, but things moved on, and so a loyal toast would be is part of today's proceedings. And then a song or a poem is usually introduced at this stage, and then an immortal memory. An immortal memory is a speech given by someone who is going to refer to the life and works of Burns. Some of it humorous, some of it serious, but all of it sincere admiration for Robert Burns and all his works. So the immortal memory is a keystone element of any evening, followed by Auld Lang Syne, and of course before that there's the reply from the ladies, and the first toast is the toast to the lassies. So following the immortal memory, there will be a toast to the lassies, and this is usually jocular and respectful, but a little bit teasing and a little bit, nothing nasty, but just a little bit teasing. And of course then there's a reply to the laddies, and this is a speech given by a lassie. And again, humorous, poking fun, little bits of irony, etc., built into it. But I think nowadays, whoever gives the toast to the lassies and the reply to the laddies, they do work together. They corroborate on these things just to try and get a balanced picture and answer each other's inquisitive and cheeky comments. So that's actually quite amusing. So that's that. And then Auld Lang Syne at the end. Of course, there may be another song or poem introduced, depends on the length of the programme. But Auld Lang Syne again is an amazing piece of history attached to Auld Lang Syne. Robert Burns actually did capture what we know today as the Auld Lang Syne, but there were various efforts going way back. I've got notes of someone by the name of Sir Robert Ayton, who wrote something initially that looked a little bit like an Auld Lang Syne. That was passed on. Alan Ramsay had an attempt at doing something, And so did Lady Nairn, the Jacobite songstress. She had a version of Auld Lang Syne. All of it is quite interesting reading, but what's quite startling is that Robert Burns captured it succinctly in the fewest words, and his content of all the verses of Auld Lang Syne, because we don't always hear all the verses, but it's reminiscing in a couthy Scottish way of how we paddled in the stream or paddled in the burn all these years ago together. He's knitted together the country, Scottish country comradeship of boys, teenagers and men over the years, how they've kept together and they've kept their memories alive, and that's what Auld Lang Syne's all about. But Burns he captured it, what we have today, and it's gone round the world, of course, as the song we all now know. And so I think that's the end of a typical Burns supper evening.
Given the brevity of his life, Burns was a prolific writer, and he was someone who obviously cared deeply for his country and for his fellow human being. What do you think are the key works which best typify his attitude to life?
What goes down or what comes to people's minds, I think, with Burns is, first of all, he's got this label of loving the lassies. Inevitably, songs of his loves come immediately to mind. I think that would be a fair statement. And he also has a love of nature, his observations of elements of life in nature. But of course, it was wider than that too, because he liked to satirically have an attack at the kirk, and rightly so, I think, in those days. And that again is something that he'd be endeared to by his poverty-stricken people in the countryside, because the kirk was quite an alarming, serious, limiting factor on the joy of people in those days. So he had an ability to satirise politics and the kirk. He loved his country. He loved Scotland. Scots were hey, a man's a man for all that. In nature, he would talk about the birks of Aberfeldy, a rosebud by my early walk, to a mouse. But interestingly, his poem To a Mouse appears at first glance to be about nature, but it actually encapsulates the little house built by the mouse in the field, encapsulates the struggle of his fellow man. So it was more than a poem just about a mouse and a nest. It actually reflected symbolically that here's a little mouse whose tiny little dwelling has been damaged, and what can the poor mouse do about it? That's the sort of thing that would capture people's minds. Relationships, he would pick up on characters. The Cotter's Saturday Night. Again, these people who endured harsh life in Scotland would never imagine that somebody could actually sit down and write a description of a Cotter's Saturday Night. Who on earth has ever actually thought about writing about a Cotter's Saturday Night? And here's a man that's come along and put it into words, and people say, oh, yes, that's what we do. This man Burns knows all about us. That's the way we live. So that's about him observing life. And there's, he's got a poem, The Old Farmer's New Year Salutation to His Mare. And on New Year's morning, I've read that for a slight difference, all they had was a little touch of honey on their porridge. That was the New Year treat. It wasn't just a normal bowl of porridge. It was a touch of honey that's been saved up carefully somewhere. That was the New Year. And Burns goes out and speaks to his horse, and he comes back and writes it. And then when he reads it back to his own family, they all roar and laugh and have a real giggle about how he's talked to the mare. And of course you can imagine every household, not every household, but a household could afford a mare, a horse, would recognise and resonate with all of that. So I think there's a collection of all of these things. Burns, there was no holds barred. He wanted to tell the world what life was like for the poor man. He wanted to explain that and describe that, and he didn't, I don't think, necessarily set out to have a hit at the government or the order of life, but he certainly wanted to describe it, and he wanted his fellow man to understand that he understood their plight. Interesting, though, I think Burns is put down as a great lover, and his relationships with the ladies has sometimes, by some, categorised him as being a lad that chased the lassies. But I want to say something that's quite important here. When you read about Burns and his loves, the ladies that he fell in love with had no future. And the lady he married, Jean Armour, she was the second oldest of about 11 children. And in her case, her father was a fairly well-to-do man. He was an artisan. He was a builder or mason. So he had a little bit of money. But Jean Armour, if she'd not met Robert Burns, was destined to spend the whole of her life actually bringing up the remaining 9 children in her mother in the home. That would have been Jean Armour's future. That's all she had to look forward to. And his other lady friends had no future other than to be a maid somewhere, and a working maid, a live-in maid. Where were they ever going to find a husband who was going to actually look after them? It was a desperate plight for a lady, a young lass in a family in those days. Where on earth? And they would have seen Burns. He was a farmer, but he wasn't a rich farmer. He was a poor farmer. But I think he attracted them because he was able to speak, he was able to converse, and he would be attractive in that sense. And so I think it's quite important to point out that he didn't go around chasing the girls and leaving them in desperate straits. One of his great qualities was he looked after everybody he ever came across. In his own family, he saw to everyone in the family was well cared for. He looked after every one of his ladies and that he fell in love with, and made sure that ultimately he did what he could for them. So, yes, his works reflected all of these elements, and that's, I think, what makes him so great. He simply told the world how he saw the world, and the world he was speaking to were the ones who actually identified that this is our world. This man is talking about us, and that's why he was lauded so quickly and immediately acclaimed.
I think it's fair to say that a major part of the enjoyment of Burns' poetry is not just an appreciation of its literary quality, but also the way that vocal performance brings it to life. How do you think that actors and recitalists generally approach the work of Burns today?
It's interesting. Burns' songs weren't initially written as songs. Burns, we know, sat on his mother's lap and she was humming tunes and songs to Burns. And as I said earlier, Betty Davidson was a cousin of Robert's mother, and they worked hard together in the old clay biggin in the cottage in Alloway. So Betty Davidson and Burns' mother had a great knowledge of background ballads, ancient hymns and songs. They would be humming in these tunes as Robert grew up. And it's said that Robert Burns didn't have quite the ear as his brother Gilbert did. Gilbert was allegedly pronounced by people at the school to be a slightly better ear for music. But the interesting thing is that Robert Burns, the more I read about him, all day long, all as far as he could go, was humming tunes to himself, at the plough, working on the farm, walking here and there. It said he always had a book under his arm. He read at the table at the family. He read. He was an enthusiast for the written word, but he was also humming these tunes. And it's interesting now to know that when he wrote something like "My love is like a red, red rose," he wrote the words to fit the tune. So he had tunes in his head. He probably spent days and weeks and months with a tune before he actually found the words that followed the tune. And so I think people who want to perform Burns' works today have to be aware of all of that. I'm not quite sure of this. I think if it's poetry, it's a subject that has to be taken seriously, and the understanding of the language that that the poem was written in by Burns has to be fully understood. I've learned a few poems at school. I don't sing and I don't recite poems, but the basic understanding is the language and the tune in itself. That's I think the fundamental elements of Burns's work. So any performer coming to produce works like that need to be aware of that.
As we discussed earlier, Burns Nights aren't just enjoyed here in Scotland. They take place right across the United Kingdom and all over the planet. So what exactly is it about his work, do you think, that continues to remain relevant and influence people even now in the present day?
I think it's the honesty and his respect and his observations, his ability to see through cant and hypocrisy. He can cut through all of that. His ability to see things clearly and deliver that message in his own way, and that is picked up. I think that's one of the most important aspects that comes to mind. I'm told he goes down quite well in Russia, for example, but and I'm sure Burns was probably quite a strict Democrat. He would reflect that in his work and in his way of life, and his writings were attacking any element that, and that's why he attacked royalty, because he didn't see that as helping the democratic process. And it's interesting that I came across recently a quote, a little story, which at the end of the American Civil War, Abe Lincoln was addressing his senators, a dinner for all the senators, and the purpose of the dinner, I believe, was to reunite America after the rigours and the horrors of the Civil War. And Abe recited a piece at the dinner, and evidently he recited Burns most evenings at home privately. But one senator said to John Hay, that was Abe's secretary, he said, "What the hell's that man talking about?" And when finished, Abe turned to John Hay and said, "Robert Burns has been my inspiration all these recent years. Without him, we would never have won the wars. So please fix a passage for me to Scotland, as I wish to pay homage to that great man." And John Hay did. But the next evening, Abe Lincoln went to the theatre. And say no more. Abe Lincoln would have loved, he would have loved a trip to Scotland to meet his hero. That's one example I can quote where Burns was accepted and appealed to the strength and the nature of a governing man, somebody who spent his life in politics and obviously saw the merits in what Burns had written. So one example at one end of the scale. And I'm sure the man in the street who loves his Scotland and loves his poetry and knows something about Burns, the more they would read, as I have, the more I read of Burns, the more I've admiration for everything that he thought and did, coming from his lowly circumstances. And I think that's what appeals to people.
Well, Robbie, the Scotland that we live in today might be quite different from the one that Robert Burns lived in, but I think you've explained to us today very clearly why it is that we've celebrated his work for so many centuries and why I think we will continue to do so for centuries to come. Thanks so much for having joined us today.
It's been a pleasure, Tom. I'm always delighted to say something about Robert Burns. I'm not an expert in Robert Burns, but what I can say is the more I read and when I get an opportunity to seek another book for my shelf, it's about the life of Robert Burns. And it's such an amazing aspect of not just Burns' life, but life in the time of Burns. It's a fascinating aspect to study what was going on in the country, and no wonder Burns reached the pinnacle as he did, because he touched on everybody's senses, and that's the great man that he was.
Robbie's book, The Spirit of Robbie Burns, is available to buy from all good independent booksellers and internet retailers worldwide. Thanks very much for having joined us today. I hope that you will have a wonderful Burns night and hope that you'll tune in again soon.
If you would like to find out more about advertising on the Extremist Publishing podcast, please visit their website at www.extremistpublishing.com for details.